The following talk was given at the Insight Meditation Center in Redwood City, California. Please visit our website at audiodharma.org.
So last week, I talked about anxiety, worry, and fear, and how to explore that in our practice. And, that's what's happening in our lives often brings up anxiety, worry, and fear, and other reactive states of mind. And this is often an area that we do explore with our meditation and our mindfulness. We explore, what does it mean to meet those states? What does it mean to understand how they come about? Today I'd like to come at our practice from a completely different perspective, because it's also a part of our practice. It's a part of what we explore and cultivate, and that is happiness. I'd like to talk about how we, different kinds of happiness actually. I think we all really want to be happy. In fact, the Buddha, at one point, somebody came to him reflecting, beings want to be happy, and why are we not happy? And so the Buddha reflected that, it's my understanding, I couldn't find this particular quote, but I know I've seen it somewhere, whether it's in the suttas or kind of a more commentarial quote. There's a teaching that says that beings wanting to be happy, engaged in their life, trying to find happiness, are actually doing the very things that keep them caught in struggle, in suffering, in anxiety, worry, and fear. And so our whole approach to happiness is caught up with, it's like the way that we go about happiness is intricately linked with anxiety, worry, fear, reactivity. So the Buddha, in his whole exploration, his journey was about this kind of struggle, this suffering that he saw in his own life, in the life of his family and friends and the people that he met, that people suffer, people struggle, and he wondered, is happiness possible? Is it possible to be free of that kind of struggle, that kind of suffering? And his own practice, his own exploration did reveal that happiness is possible. In his very first teaching his very first Dharma talk, apparently, as it is recorded in the Pali Canon, in the suttas, he talked about the Four Noble Truths. And we can look at the Four Noble Truths as reflecting both the side of struggle and suffering and the side of happiness. The first two Noble Truths kind of speak to our usual way of being in the world, that there is suffering, and that the suffering that we are largely caught in, the kind of suffering that the Buddha did find it's possible to be free of, is a suffering that is related to wanting things to be a certain way, wanting to have certain things, wanting to get rid of the certain things. So it's tied up with a particular perspective on how happiness comes to be. I have happiness by getting things that I want, by having people see me a certain way, by having the relationship that I want, by getting rid of things that don't please me. That whole perspective of that's how I'll find happiness, the Buddha pointed to that as being basically that wanting things to be in a certain way is intimately tied up with that kind of struggle, that kind of suffering. And on the other side of the Four Noble Truths, the third and fourth Noble Truths, he said it's possible to have happiness. The ending of suffering it's framed in the third Noble Truth. It is possible for suffering to end. And the word that's usually used for that is nibbana, or cooling, going out. And so it is understood to be the ending of that wanting that is this freedom from suffering. And yet the Buddha described that freedom as the greatest happiness. It's not just a flat, neutral, dull place to not want things. It actually is a very full and the state is one of openness and connectedness, not one of being closed down and being dull or disconnected. And then he said there's a path to this happiness. And so over and over in the suttas, in many places in the text, it talks about how happiness is a part of our path, a part of how the spiritual journey unfolds. But it's not the happiness the way we normally think of it. And so this is a little bit of a challenge for us, because the whole way that we've been, that our culture orients us, that our experience even orients us, is that we become happy when we get something that we want. That's what our experience shows us, and it's certainly what our commercials point to. It's what the whole culture kind of directs us to, and so we're getting that message. And it's kind of like there's something in computer science and algorithms called a false peak. It's if you have a curve that has one hill, and then it drops down, and then you have another hill that's higher. As you have a computer program that's trying to find the highest point on that curve with a lower peak and a higher peak, you have to have the algorithm be willing to not stop at the first highest point it finds, and then keep searching, and it will find a higher peak. And it's kind of like this with the way that we typically engage in finding happiness. We have been taught through our cultures, through our experiences in life, that getting what I want makes me happy. And we look around at that point and it's like, well, I don't see any better way to be happy, perhaps. And so we're not willing to let go of that kind of approach to search for a different kind of happiness. And if we don't hear anybody telling us that there's other kinds of happiness out there that are worth letting go of that happiness for, we would never even think to abandon that approach. In the Dhammapada, one of the poems in the Dhammapada, which is a collection of verses said to be said by the Buddha, if by giving up a lesser happiness one could experience greater happiness, a wise person would renounce the lesser to behold the greater. And so I'd like to talk a little bit today about some of those different kinds of happiness, pointing to the possibility of maybe a willingness to let go of our habitual ways and in our spiritual journey to open to other kinds of happiness. My experience, and certainly what is taught in the suttas, is that the happiness of sense pleasure, the happiness of getting what we want, the Buddha calls it the happiness of possession. He says, yes, this is happiness. Of course there's a kind of happiness that comes from that. It's the least kind of happiness there is. So, but let's explore that kind of happiness a little bit, because the Buddha did name it. He said there's a wholesome kind of happiness that comes from the happiness of possession. In one sutta, he says, there are four kinds of happiness that can be achieved by someone who enjoys sense pleasure. What are they? The happiness of possession, the happiness of enjoyment, the happiness of debtlessness, and the happiness of blamelessness. So the happiness of possession. Someone who possesses wealth, who possesses what they have, acquired by energetic striving, amassed by the strength of one's arms, earned by the sweat of one's brow, righteous wealth righteously gained. So essentially, possessions gained in an ethical manner. He says this is a cause for happiness. And we can enjoy that wealth by using it in a way that supports our families and our communities. He says, what's the happiness of enjoyment? With this wealth that's gained ethically, one enjoys that wealth by offering, by doing meritorious deeds, is what it says here. So by behaving in connection with others, by taking care of your family, by offering to people who have less than you, things like that. It's that there's an enjoyment of generosity, and I'm going to talk about these a little bit as we go. Then I think it's interesting. He points to the happiness of debtlessness. It's like in the possessing. We are most happy when we full out possess those things and don't owe money for, or don't owe somebody else for those things. When one thinks I'm not indebted to one to any degree, whether small or great, one experiences happiness and joy. And then blamelessness, which is basically ethical conduct. And so these are ways, kind of more related to ordinary ways that we consider happiness. The happiness of sense pleasure, having what we want. The Buddha here points to having things, acquiring things in an ethical manner. And so that's an important piece of the happiness there. You might find, if you acquire things in an unethical manner, that the happiness is marred by the thoughts of what you've done to get that. And yet still, this kind of happiness has some downsides to it. It's connected a lot with our usual understanding that having things is what will make us happy. That perspective that is the best kind of happiness, that false peak of this is how I can find happiness. The way that works, part of the reason, yes, when we get something we want, or we get rid of something we don't want, we do experience a kind of a delight of the having that the Buddha points to in the happiness of possession. What we also experience in that moment is and we may not consciously be aware that we're experiencing this, but in the process by which we normally engage in wanting things and getting things and having things and the happiness that comes from having, there is the wanting as a piece of the equation. We want something. We want to have something be a certain way. We want to have something that we like. We want to get rid of something we don't like. So there's this piece of wanting. And wanting itself, whether we're consciously aware of it or not, and we're often not consciously aware of it, wanting creates a feeling of instability. It creates a feeling of kind of lack that is not a kind of a place of well-being. And so when there is wanting in our system, there's already a feeling of non-well-being, a feeling of lack. Often when we're wanting something, especially if we're wanting something pleasant, our minds are kind of leaping over the present moment to that experience of lack, that experience of wanting. We're not paying attention to that experience of lack. We are instead thinking about how great it's going to be when we get it. And so our mind is projected into the future, thinking about that and is happy thinking about that, even though it doesn't have it yet. It's kind of thinking about how great it's going to be. And so there's a kind of a pleasure to that fantasy, basically, that represses or has us disconnected from the feeling of lack that comes with wanting. And so through this whole process, we fantasize about getting it. We get it. Maybe we get it. Maybe we don't. But if we get it, we think that the happiness comes from the having. And actually, a lot of what's going on there is that the reason we feel so much delight when we get something that we want is because the feeling of lack goes away. And we haven't actually consciously noticed that part of it. And so a lot of the happiness of having, the happiness of possession, comes as the feeling of lack goes away. When we're caught by that perspective, that usual perspective of I need to get what I want, we have bought into the view that wanting holds, the kind of belief that's encompassed in wanting that says, having that thing will make me happy. The perspective of wanting kind of it's kind of encompassing, and we don't recognize at that point that a kind of happiness would also come if the feeling of wanting went away. Wanting is not going to tell you that. Wanting is so thoroughly convinced of its perspective, and it thoroughly believes that having what I want will make me happy. Wanting is not going to tell you, oh, by the way, if wanting goes away, there won't be that feeling of lack, and there won't be that need. So one of the things the Buddha suggests around the happiness of sense pleasure, and I love this teaching because it really points to start where we are. He says, he doesn't say, notice that there's the happiness of sense pleasure and try to stop wanting things. What he says is, notice the happiness of sense pleasure and notice how long it lasts. How long does the happiness of having what we want, getting what we want, how long does it actually last? Often not that long. And so this begins to point to the kind of lesser nature of this kind of happiness. It's fleeting, it's brief much of the time. It's not a kind of a reliable, ongoing kind of happiness. It's a kind of happiness that forces us over and over again. It's like we get something that we want. We have that release of the wanting. We feel good about that. We feel we have what we want, and yet our minds kind of lose interest in what we have. It's like, oh, really, what I really liked was that getting, that feeling of getting, of possess, that moment. And again, a lot of the pleasure of that moment comes from a feeling of being in control, a feeling of the wanting going away. So there's just a whole bunch of stuff going on that we're not really noticing. And so that's what we want to have happen again. And so we have something that we want, and we're not satisfied there. And so this kind of happiness of sense pleasure gets us on let's say a hamster wheel of, oh, got that thing. Oh, that's nice. Yeah, that feels pretty. Oh, what about the next thing? It's like, oh, is there more to want? And sometimes what even happens is that the mind has become kind of in a neutral place. It's like, yeah, that kind of thing that made me happy. It's like, well, it's okay now, but the last time I was really happy was when I got something I wanted. So what do I want? We actually start looking for something to want in order to have the wanting go away. This is essentially what's going on underneath. It's not what our minds are telling us, but I mean, it's not what we're seeing above the surface of our subconscious, but that's actually a big piece of that process. We look for something to want in order to have the wanting go away.
That's messed up.
It's messed up. It's messed up. So, this curiosity of, so how long does this happiness last, begins to reveal this messed upness, actually. So, what are other forms of happiness, and how do we begin to touch into them? The first form that, I kind of like to go through the ones the Buddha talked about a little bit, the happiness of enjoyment, which is sharing. Essentially, the happiness of enjoyment is partly about sharing your possessions. So it's generosity. There's a happiness that comes when we are exploring offering from a heart of... Well, let me just say it this way, that when we are generous with a heart of complete openness, I mean, we have to explore generosity at first, and there's often some ooh, can I let this go? Do I want to let this go? Or so it's a process, it's a practice. But as we approach an open-hearted offering, and we see this at times in our lives. When you feel an open-hearted offering, you will notice, or can notice at least, that there's a kind of happiness that comes in the contemplation of the giving. So thinking about it beforehand. There's a happiness that comes in the offering and in the seeing the person receive the gift. And then there is a happiness that comes as we reflect on the offering. And this isn't about having something. In fact, it's the opposite. It's about giving away. So as we find those moments of kind of a pure kind of giving, it's useful to reflect on them. So, at one point, I offered a gift to a nun who was going off to Burma, and I bought her these audio tapes to help her learn Burmese. And there was this kind of delight in thinking about that, and that just her face. It was just overjoyed when she received these tapes. And I'm still delighted by reflecting on this. That gift, she spends much of her time in Burma, and that gift, and she said to me, that gift was the seed or the cause by which she's now able to communicate in Burma. So it's a delightful thing to reflect on. So when we do something that way, when we offer something from that perspective, we can reflect back on it and feel perhaps some of that kind of happiness of not of having something, but of freely offering something. It's a different kind of happiness than the happiness of having. And in its nature, as I described, it is said that when we are generous in this way, there's a happiness before, during, and after the act. So it's got a kind of a longer life. So we again look at this kind of happiness, and how long does this kind of happiness last? It's got a much more of a lingering impact on us than the happiness of having does. And yet, as I said, we do have to cultivate this. It's not like we're going to immediately just be freely generous and able to behave in that way. But we can explore it. We can cultivate the practice of offering and notice where we clench, where it's hard. Even in simple gestures, like offering somebody an easy merge on the freeway. That could be considered an act of generosity. So you might take some period of time, one day when you're driving, and explore, okay, this is my day to offer this generosity. How does it feel? I would encourage it if you have enough time to get where you're going. Don't put yourself in a conflict there. But so if you have enough time one day where you're not feeling rushed, backing off and letting somebody have an easy merge and thinking of it as generosity. So many of our interchanges with people can be framed this way. Our encounters can be understood as generosity so much. But we don't think of it that way. We think of it as a fee for service or something. At one point, a friend of mine and another Dharma teacher and I were having lunch together, and we were, paying for the meal at the end. And he said, "Do you ever think about?" And I hadn't at this point. He said, "Do you ever think about?" And he wasn't talking about the tip as being generosity. He was talking about the fact that we were paying for our meal as being a kind of a connection of generosity because we were supporting the livelihood of other beings, that it's an offering. We can frame many of our encounters this way. We can be recipients of generosity in many of our encounters. One day recently in the grocery store, I was walking around and just kind of blown away thinking about how many beings it took to put all of this stuff in the store where I could come in and buy my milk and my eggs and my cheese. It's like, wow, how many beings, not only human beings, but other beings, it took. That I was receiving other people's offerings. And so that's a kind of a gratitude, kind of the flip side of generosity is gratitude. And so we can explore our lives from this perspective through reflection, through thinking about it. As you go through your day sometime, you might explore that perspective of how am I offering things? How am I receiving? Is this framework. We can explore things through the frame of generosity. The Buddha encouraged this of his monks. He says, when you're rinsing your alms bowl, you're rinsing your alms bowl and it's got a little bits of food in it and stuff. And he says, as you throw out that alms bowl, you might wish, may the beings here be nourished by the little bits of food. So that it's a kind of a conscious recognition that rinsing of the alms bowl is offering something to, ants and bugs on the ground. He encouraged his monks to reflect in that way. And so bringing reflection in around this. This may have to be a 2-part talk. I've got, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 kinds of happiness I want to talk about. Maybe even 8. So I'll get as far as I do today, and then continue next week. I don't want to try to rush through things, and I do want to leave some time too. So, then there's the happiness of non-harming, the bliss of blamelessness. This is a kind of happiness that comes in our connection and in our relationship to other beings. Our heart responds to this connection. For most of us, there's a kind of a very natural, empathetic response to other beings. And this is aligning with this empathetic response to other beings and really acknowledging that it's there. And it's there from the time we're born. I understand, the whole teaching on mirror neurons is part of this, that we when we see somebody experiencing something, we feel it. And so when we see a baby smile, we feel something. If we see somebody get hurt, we feel something. It's part of our makeup as human beings that we have this empathetic connection. And I think over our lives we sometimes try to shut this down because it can be overwhelming, both to be in the field of the joy and the sorrow. It's like there's so much going on. It's like, how do I open to it all? How do I open to the suffering of the bombing in Aleppo and the joy of someone giving birth in this day? How does the heart stretch to hold that? And one place that this, there's different places that this connects. This connects both with the teaching on ethics and the teaching on metta, on love. And the teaching on ethics is basically that as we understand that connection thoroughly, as we really open to that empathetic connection, our heart naturally does not wish to cause harm. It does not wish to create suffering in the world. And so this is the framing of ethics in the Buddhist tradition, is connecting to this very natural impulse towards empathy and aligning with that. We do start to see that when we hurt others, it hurts us. There's a book called Childhood's End by Arthur Clarke. I don't know if any of you have read it. It's one of my favorite Arthur Clarke books. It talks about beings from another planet visiting Earth. The first part of this novel is beings from another planet visiting Earth, and they're evaluating the human species to see if they can evolve to a higher kind of being, something like that. So it's that kind of story. And the first thing that they realize is that they have to get the ethics of people in line. And so what they do, these beings, is they create the conditions for people to immediately feel the consequences when other people feel suffering, so that they don't have that shut down. And the story was that, they used to have all these bullfights, so as soon as that bull was run through with the sword, every person in the audience felt as if they had been run through with a sword. That's what the beings created, was the condition for people to feel the consequences of that pain of another being. And we have this capacity. It's just that we shut it down with delusion. And so in the book it says that those activities immediately stopped. It's like, of course. If you go to something like that and you feel like you're being run through with a sword, you're not going to go anymore. So anyway, that's just a point of the understanding that as we open to the consequences of causing harm, very naturally, we don't wish to cause harm. And so part of it is beginning to recognize when we cause harm and how it lands on us and the kinds of stories we tell ourselves. It's amazing, actually, what our minds will do when we've caused harm. It's like, oh, well, it wasn't really that bad, or maybe they actually deserved it, or it wasn't even really my fault, Our minds will tell all kinds of stories. I had an incident recently, last year and a half, I don't remember. I think it was about a year and a half ago, where an action that I took created an enormous amount of suffering. It was so painful to see that. Now, it hadn't been my intention, of course. I hadn't thought, oh, I'm going to do this thing and I want everybody to suffer. And this is part of what we have to explore as we see our actions creating harm in the world. Is, yes, many times I mean, sometimes we are actively out there saying, I want that person to be miserable, but many times it's simply unknowing. It's non-awareness. It's ignorance that has us do something that creates suffering. And so this is part of our practice around ethical conduct, is the willingness to acknowledge, yes, that action caused suffering. What did I not understand? What can I learn from this? So this is understood to be a skillful reflection. It's conscience. Conscience. We look and say, yeah, that it hurts. It hurts to cause that kind of suffering. It's one of the things we have to get to explore here around that experience of the hurt or the feeling of conscience. That acknowledgement, yeah, I did that, and that wasn't such a good thing, and what can I learn from it? It feels very close to shame and guilt, that feeling. Very close to shame and guilt. Very close to that state where we are telling ourselves, I'm a bad person, I'm a horrible person, and how can I live with myself? That extra stuff is just that, it's extra. And yet, in this exploration around ethics, we need to open to that feeling of conscience without kind of heaping ourselves with guilt and shame. So that's a practice. And in this event that happened, 18 months or so ago, that was really my practice. It was clear to me that I had not acted intentionally to cause harm, and yet there was so much suffering that was created, I could not but feel it. And in feeling that, I ended up talking to a lot of people about what had happened and what I could learn from it, and made reparations as best I could about what happened. And I did learn some things that I carry now. I think the key piece that I feel like I learned was, I was in a little bit of a rush, and somebody had asked me to communicate something, and I wrote a quick email and communicated it, but I was in the midst of so many other things. I hadn't really stopped to say, how might this land? What might happen here? And so the slowing down, the slowing down, and if I'm in a rush already, not to rush something else in there. So this piece of, this has been a learning, a kind of what can I take away from this? And so we have to be willing to acknowledge our own mistakes. It's a huge piece of exploring ethics. And what's the happiness of this? The happiness of this is that as we engage ethically, as we connect with people, there's kind of a happiness of the connection itself, which is part of the meta field, so the next piece that we'll talk about. But there's also the happiness of creating the conditions where beings, well, there's two pieces to it. There's one called the bliss of blamelessness, which is what the Buddha explicitly pointed to here. And there's the bliss of blamelessness. We do not feel, the remorse, the guilt. Our mind is not like, beating us up. That kind of, when we behave ethically, we are not caught in that cycle of blaming and shaming and guilt and self-judgment or blaming others. We're not in that cycle. So there's the bliss of blamelessness, of knowing that you are engaging with this empathetic connection. And then there's the gift, the happiness of the gift of giving other people a sense of safety in your presence. So both of those are happiness, or a kind of a form of happiness that is less about having something and more about how we are in the world, just our engagement with the world. And then I'll talk briefly about the other piece. I'll try to get through these three. The kind of the happiness of relationship here is what I'm exploring, right? We've got the happiness of the connection of being generous, the happiness of the connection of being engaging with non-harming, and then there's just the happiness of the connection itself, the love, the feeling of being connected. Actually feels good. It feels good to wish ourselves well and to wish others well. This simple, kind feeling of kindness. It feels good. There's a kind of happiness there. There's a way that we might resist that. I think partly because of our familiar view about happiness being around having what we want. In wishing for others to be happy, which is kind of a basic wish of metta, it's not exclusive. It's not that we're wishing for others to be happy and for us to be miserable. We're actually wishing for happiness for all, including ourselves. We are one of all beings, as we wish. May all beings be happy. That includes this being. And yet our usual way of thinking about happiness is, where I'm happy when I get what I want. If I have the job I want, if I have the house I want, if I have, certain kinds of possessions. And it's kind of about status and material wealth a lot. And, our perspective on that is, and possibly truly, there's only so much of it to go around. And so there's a feeling of, if I wish somebody else well, if I wish somebody else happiness, am I wishing for myself to not have something? I certainly, when I first started doing the metta practice, it felt very uncomfortable for me to wish happiness to other people, because I thought, it's a zero-sum game. If I'm not wishing other people to be happy, it means I'm not going to be as happy. And so this happiness of connection points to, again, a different kind of happiness. It's the happiness of just the wish for well-being for both ourselves and others. It's the happiness that takes delight when someone else feels or has some kind of success. It's actually a kind of connection that is an open heart when somebody else is suffering. The feeling of the open heart itself, is one that is unconstricted. And that's a kind of happiness, actually, as we feel into that. The more I touch into the heart that is not tight and defending and holding and justifying and trying to hold on to, the more there's this feeling of kind of just this resonant heart in there that kind of shakes like jello when it meets the world. That unconstricted heart is a form of happiness. So again, this is a different kind of happiness. I remember that when one of the early times I really felt what it meant to feel happy for the happiness of someone else. That had been a real kind of block for me early in my practice. There was too much fear there to really feel it. But in one case, I was on retreat with a friend, and it went through cycles here. I was on retreat with her at one point, and I would see her like just being so mindful, and so present, and I would think, oh, she's doing way better than me, and I'm just like really failing here. So I would see this, I'd see her be just looking like she was blissed out, and I'm thinking, I'm not blissed out. And so there wasn't a delight in seeing her that way. But at one point, so exploring this, it's like, wow, okay. And then at one point I saw her and just saw how clearly present she was and how mindful she was. And I felt so much joy in her presence. It brought me into presence to feel that. It was a gift to feel that. So that constricted heart is like, oh, me, and oh, how can I have the bliss that everybody that she has, or how, that creates a feeling of constriction. And the open heart can see that and have a completely different relationship and experience joy, delight, happiness. Even the feeling of compassion, I wouldn't actually call it happiness per se, but it is a feeling of non-resistance. It's unconstricted around suffering that's happening in the world. And that heart that is unconstricted there naturally resonates with that. That's our empathetic relationship. And if that heart can be unconstricted and resonate, it wants to act, to do something. And maybe all that we can do is to feel it and to be a witness and not shut down about it. Maybe that's all that we can do. Maybe we can also, offer support if we're in a position to do that. But sometimes we can't. And the piece that I want to point to is the feeling of helplessness that we sometimes feel when we watch someone else suffer. The feeling that there's nothing I can do, and so we want to constrict. We don't want to feel that suffering. And that constriction is a form of craving and clinging and hardness. And so the heart that can be a witness, it's a gift to the world, actually, when we cannot shut down around suffering. And it does take time. It's not something that we immediately can go to. But beginning to recognize, ooh, wow, there's fear here. I'm afraid to open to that suffering. In that moment, not like forcing yourself to say, well, I have to be with all those images of the bombings right now, but, oh, can I be with the fear? That itself is a kind of compassion too. It's a compassion for ourselves of where we are. So I think I'd like to stop there. I'll just mention some of the others just to give you a pointer for next week. So mostly today I've talked about the happiness of that connection with other. So happiness that comes with wholesome relationships. And then we turn in, so wholesome relationships with others. And next week I'll talk about what it means to have a wholesome relationship to ourselves and how happiness can come with that. And so there's a happiness of just being present. There's a happiness of concentration. The happiness that comes with being connected and settled in the mind. There's a happiness that comes with practice, with understanding, with insight, with wisdom. So I'll talk about those next week. So any comments or thoughts or questions? Yeah, and could you use the mic? There's a button on the side just under the white.
I was reflecting on your comments about happiness for other people's happiness. And because there are different types of happiness, I think we've all been in a position where you see someone who has acquired something, that job, that house, that partner, and you want to celebrate their happiness. And it's not necessarily because you feel like it takes away from your own, but I sometimes look at it and think, I'm glad they're happy now, but that's not going to last. And I wish they realized that or something. I wish they put almost less importance on that.
Uh-huh.
Not from a place of moral superiority or anything like that. It almost concerns me when they're so happy about a certain thing. And I don't know how to sort of gel those two
Yeah.
to be happy for them.
Well, partly I think we explore the kind of, one thing about practice is that we have to explore the paradoxes. You know, that, yes, there is a kind of a delight that we can have when somebody has a kind of success and we see that they are happy about that. You know, there's a part of us that can celebrate that with them unabashedly, and a part of us that also understands, yes, this is impermanent. And, potentially depending on how much, how much clinging there is in that, then there will be suffering that follows. And yet it's not so much about not being as happy when something happens, but understanding it as a certain kind of happiness. And that's something that we can't necessarily teach to others. If you if you went up to that person and said, "Yeah, you're happy now, but this is impermanent." Probably what's going to happen is how long is that person going to be your friend? But you need to hold the paradox yourself, and potentially be available for that person to be the witness when things happen. And the other piece about this, the happiness, is that, in my understanding, we are exploring what it means to be happy when people are happy, have a true kind of happy, or a truer kind of happiness. And so the happiness of righteous wealth righteously gained, that's fine. But we are not celebrating the happiness of somebody who steals something and thinks they're happy about it. There's my understanding is that the happiness, shared happiness, the metta or the mudita, the delight in the happiness of others, is delight in wholesome happiness, which is included. It is wholesome to take delight in possessions gained ethically and not harming others. That's a fine kind of happiness, and it is a lesser kind of happiness. And so, we have to hold that paradox in our own heart and watch for yourself. The little feelings of whatever it is, those feelings of, I wish you weren't quite so happy about that. What's that? What is that? There's something interesting there to see. Maybe some of it is the wisdom that you've gained from your own practice, but there may be another piece there that might be worth looking at too. Yeah. And now we need to stop. So, thank you. To be continued.